have had a great relationship over we're going on almost 12 years now that we've been in communication. We certainly have seen a lot of how ports have actually changed, how the maritime industry has actually changed, and we're actually going through a lot of changes that are actually going to be coming up, both because of, obviously regulations. Climate change has certainly had a significant amount of impact in terms of how we operate our business. Certainly going to be continued to do so. And at the end of the day, it's really the right thing for us to do is to really try to improve our operations. So if you don't mind, Jeff, I'm going to share my screen right now so we can jump right into this. And we can get going pretty quickly as soon as I can shift everything around. Because, when you teach and you have a variety of different classes, nothing ever wants to go exactly the way that we want each and every time. There we go. So thank you, everybody, for taking some time to be with me here today. Certainly a personal shout out to all of my students that decided to join. Yes, like I mentioned to you guys, I do have a list of everybody that's here. So you will get extra credit for joining us. Make sure that you remember that you have to tell me which class that you want the extra credit assigned to. And don't forget, you also have to be online for the entire presentation just to make sure that you get the full credit. Okay, so we're just going to talk, like I mentioned before, like Jeff had said, that we're going to be talking about the decarbonization of the maritime industry. So some of the issues or the topics that I'm going to cover are going to be obviously focused on the IMO, or the International Maritime Organization. There are going to be a number of changes that are going to be coming up in January, some of which have already been in place, such as the EU ETS. So this is the European Union Emissions Trading System. So it's kind of like a cap and trade type system that we'll talk about. In addition to CII, so this was another rule and regulation that the IMO came up with, or the UN came up with, I believe in 2007, in which they're going to start regulating emissions on a variety of different transportation sectors. The maritime part is actually just starting to come into that forum, and it's going to start taking a much bigger effect worldwide. We'll talk about in terms of the steamship lines and the number of investments that they've made to try to improve and decarbonizing the vessels. And that's obviously we also want to talk about the port's role in helping our ports move forward in decarbonizing the maritime industry. So again, this is a lot of it has to do with this partnership, that interrelation between all of the different parties within the supply chain. So we'll talk a little bit about the U.S. DOT and the MERA grants information and the awards that they've been able to help some of the ports take care of some of that investment. Some of the port efficiencies to reduce some of those emissions as well. Obviously, truck emissions. So certainly, again, as another factor in transportation, nothing can really move, especially in that last mile, without a truck being involved at some point. Okay, and that's certainly we're going to finish up the conversation today, discussing some of the different green fuel capability and when and where we think that some of the different fuels are actually going to be the most effective. So in terms of the IMO and trying to get to their net zero goal. So back in July of this year, the IMO met 1,800 delegates trying to figure out exactly what are going to be the new rules and regulations that the IMO is going to enact on the maritime industry. So in July, they came up with this goal that by 2030, 40% of they're going to try to get the emissions reduced by 40% of carbon emissions by 2030, with the goal of also extending it at least to having at least 5% of the fuel coming from alternative fuel sources. Okay. Then there's also going to say that by 2040, or even by 2030, they want to have at least 10% use of alternative fuels with the goal of 20%, but while they're also striving for 30%. And then by 2040, they're hoping to at least move that bar up a little bit further to a 70% use, but still striving for 80%. Now, while that might sound very nebulous and very confusing, and in fact, the IMO actually got a lot of attention, somewhat negative, from a variety of different stakeholders, certainly those that are more focused on improving the environment, saying that, hey, we needed to have much more strict rules and regulations, and the maritime industry is just going to kind of wait for the IMO to actually set those rules. Well, In a sense, maybe. In my perspective, I think that the IMO not having anything regulated and hammered down provides a greater opportunity for the industry to actually take a leading role, right? And by taking this leading role, the industry, the ship companies can now come forward to the IMO and say, hey, listen, there's a number of different fuels out there, none of which are the best, but we're going to at least invest our money. We're going to show our commitment to trying to improve the environment. And by doing so with this investment, we're going to at least be able to test to see or determine the technologies. Which of the different fuels are going to work? Which of the different fuels are going to work better? And which of the different fuels may or may not be readily available? So, keep in mind that what most of us forget, most consumers definitely forget, is that the fuels or the ships also need to have a gas station available, right? So just like where you or I, when our cars, when that fuel tank starts to run low, we go to a gas station, then we can pretty much find gas stations all around the United States. We pull into a gas station, we fill up our cars, we move on our merry way. Not the same for a ship. Okay. And now with these changes, it's going to make a bigger change in terms of the type of fuels we use. And then we got to make sure that the fuels are actually going to be available then. So the IMO was actually trying to push having that establish a global marine standard, okay, as well as part of that pricing scheme. So they then said that they're going to have more details about the pricing scheme and the actual marine fuels that they want to use sometime in 2024 or in 2025, but definitely it's going to be in place by 2027. So again, if I'm a ship company, I'm investing $100 million or $130 million on a brand new ship. I have to put a different type of engine that can burn a certain type of fuel that I don't even know if it's actually going to be approved or accepted by the IMO in a matter of 3 years. So again, it's this idea that I'm supposed to spend a lot of money and it might change. And then if it does change, is it going to be change in my favor? Because again, if it's not, will my engine be able to change enough for me to use a variety of different fuels? Okay, so there's still a lot of confusion left out in the world, especially in regards to how the IMO came out with some of these new regulations. So even in terms of their carbon intensity indicator or the CII that they developed, they came out and basically said, based on the way that we're going to rate the different shipping lines, we're going to actually give them a grade, right? So very, very similar to being in school, we have a grade from an A all the way down to an E. Well, all right. We don't use E's in academia. We use an F. So you can take it for what it's worth. So basically, it's just this rating system. So if I'm a good ship company and if I've invested enough money to at least show that my vessels are going to be changing over to the more green alternative fuels, and I'm actually showing, and I can prove that we're using these fuels, then I'm going to be able to get this A rating. Yet on the other hand, that if it's much more difficult for me to make this change, I may not have made the investment in changing my vessels, or I haven't changed my approach to improving my sustainability record, my sailing record, how I actually operate the vessels, none of which has changed. Therefore, I'm going to have this E rating. Okay. Now, the interesting part is that I haven't seen come out with the IMO, and I certainly could be wrong, is that the IMO is not saying, well, if you end up with an E, there may be a fine that's going to come into play. Okay, we're not really sure exactly what that penalty is going to be. All right. Yet on the other hand, what could actually occur much more frequently is that as most BCOs are now starting to be rated by their customers on their environmental or sustainability measurements, they could actually use the CII and then actually go back and say, as a BCO, by the way, is a beneficial cargo owner or a shipper. So the BCOs could then say, well, based on the number of the shipping lines that I use and all of the different containers that I ship across the world, most of my containers or a significant majority of my containers, X%, are actually being moved on A vessels or with a A-rated shipping company. So because of this new CII indicator, I can then use, as a BCO, I can use that type of a measurement tool as a metric to compare myself against my competition. So if the consumer is really on board with improving our environment, again, we can start to vote with our dollars. We can vote with our pocketbook. that the only companies I want to use are going to be, or the products I'll buy are going to be products that are going to be shipped on vessels that are going to be in that A rating. Okay. I certainly don't want to be using or buying goods from a company that's going to be using vessels of an E or that F rating. Right. So certainly we got much more regulations on the horizon. The EU is also coming out with their ETS, the emissions trading system, that came out in 2005. So the airline industry has gone through this regulation for a number of years. It's now going to start to take effect on the maritime industry as of January 1st of 2024. So this is going to be a major impact in terms of how ship companies operate in and out of the European ports. So for example, if we're a steamship line and we have a sailing going from Asia going into Rotterdam, as soon as that vessel starts to come in near the port of Rotterdam, it's going to have to make sure that it reduces the amount of emissions. So it has to switch over to a different type of fuel, hopefully reduce their emissions levels. So that's one part. The second part is also that in this entire route, okay, so X number of nautical miles, the shipping line itself is going to have to make sure that they keep track of the number of emissions for the entire journey, not just while that they're in the navigational waters of the EU, but for the entire journey. That becomes critical, especially for the steamship lines, because as they go forward throughout the year, they're going through this whole cap and trade system. So the shipping lines are going to have to buy into the cap and trade. They're going to have to buy allowances for a certain number of emissions for the year and then hope that they don't exceed it. If they begin to see that they're exceeding the allowances, then they're going to have to go out and buy even more allowances, right? At the end of the year, if they have too many allowances left over, they can sell them, right? So they can trade or they can save them for the next year. But again, it's a lot of upfront investments by the shipping lines when, again, it becomes very confusing and challenging, especially in terms of, well, why should I be regulated for the entire journey when only a small portion of it is actually within the EU waters, okay? So that's where it becomes much more challenging and convincing or hard for the companies to actually try to move forward with, okay? The other challenge that's going to be even more interesting that I see potentially coming up, especially when we look at the cap and trade, is if the EU is going in this direction, there's nothing to say that other countries couldn't do the exact same thing. Okay, so what would happen if the US also developed its own ETS type system, or if Asia developed it, or China, or Singapore, right? So every country that could theoretically develop its own ETS system where every country is actually managing their own cap and trade. And then as a shipping line, I'm going into all of these different countries. So the complexity becomes much more compounded and very difficult to manage, okay? And obviously in anything in business, when things become much more complex and challenging, then you have a much greater opportunity for some less than stellar players where they may start to skirt around the issue. Then we have a matter in which we're trying to improve emissions and make the environment more clean. But yet this cap and trade also is advocating for a market system. Well, a market system is actually going to be driven by a profitability model. So if I have an opportunity to make more money because companies are not going to operate as green, well, certainly the opportunity to make more money may seem to be a little bit better off, right? So there is no global standard yet in terms of what would happen if this cap and trade system really begins to expand elsewhere. All right, so now in terms of the shipping lines. So I just gave you guys an idea in terms of what the regulations look like, both from the IMO and the EU, for example, and some countries are also developing some of their own. But now here's some of the environment which the shipping lines are now trying to show. Here's what we're looking to do. Amazon and IKEA actually got together a few months ago, actually, I believe by sometime before the summer, and came out and said, we are going to commit giving 40,000 containers a year to be moved on ships powered only by alternative green marine fuels. So by 2030, we're automatically going to say every year, our shipping contract is going to be set at 40,000 containers, right? So I did some quick math using just a rough spot rate for a global average of a container, 40-foot container of about $1,500. So 40,000 containers for a year is going to equal about $60 million in revenue. Okay. Now, obviously, to you and I, significant amount of money to especially put into our savings account. Yet at the same time, when it also costs $130 million to build, I'm still a little bit short. But I at least begin to see that my BCOs, my customers of the shipping line, are now becoming a lot more dedicated and focused and serious about, hey, shipping lines, if you make this investment, we're going to help support you by giving you our business. And not just by giving you our business, we're actually going to promote that we're giving you our business. Okay, so now this can actually go back and tie in very well with the CII that we just talked about in terms of that rating system. Okay, CMA CGM also came out with an investment for $10 billion to green their entire fleet of 77 vessels. Evergreen, not to be outdone, says, hey, we're also going to drop an extra $5 billion so we can build 24 new vessels. They're going to have a dual fuel between methanol and green diesel. MSC, certainly, again, this is the one fun part about the shipping industry, like many of you already know. They love competing against each other, and they always have to be up on top of the stage. And if you don't believe me, just look at the size of the ships, and they keep changing and getting larger and larger. No sooner does one company come out with a 24,116 TEU ship, the next company is going to come out and have a 24,117 TEU ship. Right. So MSC says, hey, we're not going to be outdone. We're going to put down $1.2 billion for a dual fuel methanol vessel. Costco, again, $2.9 billion for 12 vessels of 24,000 TEUs that are going to be a methanol dual fueled ship. So, and again, the 24,000 TEUs are those massive, very large container ships that are going to be sailing on the oceans. But most of those ships may not even be coming to the United States because most of our ports can't accept that size of a ship. MOL also going forward with at least 90 ships to have those vessels be LNG, methanol, so a dual fuel between the two different types of fuel uses. And again, currently, Tote and Crowley both are operating some of their vessels with an LNG type vessel like the one here in the photo. So right now, but you also got to think, well, if it takes about 18 months for us to come out with a new build or a new vessel, I have to invest a lot of that money today for a product that may not even be ready to sail for another 18 months. All right, so let's go back to what the EU regulations were before. Okay, so if we come out and I invest the money today, it's going to take me probably until the middle of 2025, maybe the end of 2025, before my vessel is even going to be sailing, so I could put it in service. And probably within another 3 years from then, the EU or the IMO may then change some of the regulations. So whatever engines I put in that ship to run on a certain type of fuel, that may actually change. So again, it's this big box of, well, we don't know. But sometimes it's better that we don't know, but because at least we're moving the conversation forward. Otherwise, it's just going to be a bunch of academics sitting around the room, and we're just talking about what we could potentially do without any action. So for me, I would much rather see some action than no action at all. All right, so let's recap a little bit about what this brave new world is going to look like. So again, I just talked about some of these nebulous regulations and guidance, not a lot of which has been very direct or forward. Just some idea that, hey, we're going to strive for these new goals of improving our emissions. It's leaving a lot up to the market. So this was actually a quote that from one of our more large populated states here in the U.S. Someone from their state EPA said, well, we're just going to leave it up to the markets and they can figure everything else out. Okay, I get it. I'm a capitalist. I love money. I love making sure that the markets are actually going to do things correctly. But because I'm also a capitalist, I also understand that the profit margins sometimes can be a little bit more important than the environment, unfortunately. And yet at the same time, too, I like to make sure that things are more easily managed and not as complex. And like I just mentioned before, that whole cap and trade thing does kind of bother me a little bit in terms of, well, how are we really going to manage this? Who's going to be regulating it especially if all of these different countries have their own system that they're developing. Is it going to be regulated? Is it going to be compulsory that we're actually required to be in part of a particular type of ETS? And then am I going to be required to be involved in every country's ETS as well? And then what happens with the penalty? Who's going to assess the penalty? If I get charged with a penalty in the EU, will that also be applicable to me being assessed a penalty here in the United States? Right? So again, we don't have a lot of the details, but moving forward is better than not moving at all. And like I just mentioned before too, there's this large capital investments by the shipping lines on various types of alternative marine fuels, and we're not really sure which one is going to be used. So just give you an idea in terms of some of the fuels that are actually being tested and actually being used. You actually have a methanol, you have hydrogen, liquid natural gas, liquid propane gas, as well as ammonia. Now, there are some uses in terms of wind sails, and solar have also been tested too. Maybe it might be a combination. At this point, we don't know. There's not been a lot of guidance, again, like from the IMO. Classification societies have been a little bit more hesitant about advocating for any one particular fuel over another. Yet at the same time, they're at least smart enough where they're helping the industry move forward. They're testing the different fuels. They've at least given them in terms of what may or may not be possible, so that when the engines are actually put into place inside the engine room, that the ships can still operate properly and, most importantly, safely. So, for example, DNV, one of the classification societies, came out with this alternative fuel report just recently, and they were saying that 1 in 5 new builds coming out in 2023 will have an alternative fuel source. So it probably will be a dual fuel source vessel. The challenge, of course, is now going to become, well, what form of those different alternative fuels right now? It only really represents about 0.5% of the entire global fleet. So really right now, based on the entire global fleet, the number of vessels that are actually operating on alternative fuels is small. It's minuscule, okay? Yet by 2028, that number is certainly going to increase to a point of being about 1,100 different vessels are going to be operating on an alternative fuel source. So my message again to the port industry, get ready. It's coming, whether we're ready for it or not. And in my opinion, again, as a business person, this might be a great opportunity for certain ports to realize, well, if we all have if we have these different types of fuels, which fuel is going to win out? I'm going to need to have some infrastructure for it. And by the way, wouldn't it be nice that my port becomes the gas station of preferred users? Okay. So we actually saw this occur back, I'll say maybe 2012-ish, when the cruise industry came out and said, hey, for all new builds of our passenger ships, they all have to be LNG. So they're going to be operated using liquid natural gas. Most environmentalists were like, great. It's wonderful to see the cruise industry starting to change their practice to improve the environment, reduce their emissions. As ship operators are like, okay, well, we're going to have to do this, but the challenge is, where's our gas stations? The United States is a significant U.S. passenger industry. It has a huge market. And right now and I could be certainly wrong, so I apologize to any port if I miss mentioning you, but I only know of 2 ports that actually have the capacity to bunker LNG, Jacksonville and Port Canaveral. And certainly both of those markets are massive passenger cruise industry markets. So again, if I'm a vessel coming from overseas and I want to pick up passengers in the United States, I need to make sure I have enough fuel in my tank to make a round trip. Okay, so if my voyage is only taking me up and down the northern eastern seaboard of the U.S., at some point I'm either going to have to make sure I can make it back to Europe to refuel, or I'm going to have to add a stop down into Florida so I can refuel. Okay, so now again, we can start to look at the market in terms of the cost of the fuels between the different ports. So again, here's a great potential opportunity for the ports to get out and actually say, we're going to be the leading port of this particular type of fuel. So in this brave new world, there's a lot of questions like I just have been talking about in terms of what's really going to come out. Which which fuel is going to be the most efficient, which fuel is going to be the most effective, which fuel is going to be more safe, which one is actually going to be sustainable, the sustainable fuel for us to use. Is it actually available? So sustainable in terms of emission is great, but is this sustainable enough to have the capacity to support how large of the industry, what slice of that pie is going to be used in that particular type of fuel? Is the marine fuel supply chain even available to now support that growing global demand? So even if the port decides, all right, we're going to be this gas station of choice, great. Well, where's the source going to be coming from? Is that source even available large enough to help support the rest of the industry? So even before, when I mentioned about some of the different types of fuels that are actually being tested, most of those, while they work, the availability, that supply chain piece still hasn't been well developed yet. Okay. This too may be an opportunity not just for ports, but also for the shipping lines to kind of work together to try to figure out what do we need to do to invest, or where do we invest to improve and grow out the supply chain to support the marine fuel demand. And then the next part is that's what I was just talking about. Really, are the ports really ready for this new world order? Are ports ready for this change when the ships come into port to switch over to a different type of fuel? If a large Maersk vessel pulls into the port, do we have the fuel available to refuel it? And if it's a situation where, unfortunately, the captain or the mate didn't measure the fuel tanks properly, all of us have those issues where we get in the car, we're taking a long drive, forget to look at the gas gauge until that low fuel light comes on. And every one of us will all say, shoot, what do I do now? Or where's the closest gas station? Ships don't have that kind of luxury like we do with our cars. All right, so even in terms of the port's investment, so here's just a quick snippet in terms of what I've been finding, in terms of where the ports are actually starting to place some of their investment dollars. On the global side, the Port of Rotterdam has invested about $1.3 billion to develop a carbon capture system with another company. So they're going to collect all the carbon in the air and use from the vessels, put it in a pipe, send it out to the North Sea, and then push it down into the seabed. Evergreen and Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners have developed a joint venture so they can start to explore the production of alternative fuels, green fuels, in Taiwan. Again, makes some really good, perfect sense based on the number of vessels going from Taiwan over to Europe. And again, I need to make sure I have that gas station available. So if I could put enough fuel in my tank for a round trip, I can at least make sure I can get back to Taiwan. Oh, and by the way, I also have a lot of my competitors that also sail through Taiwan. And if they don't have the infrastructure available to fuel up their ships, I have a great opportunity where I can actually use my fuel to fuel up my competitors' ships, certainly at a cost. So again, that's additional revenue for me. NYK, as of March of next year, is actually coming out with a brand new LNG fueled bunkering vessel. So the bunker itself, the vessel, will have the capacity to do ship-to-ship bunkering of LNG, but it's also going to be powered by the same LNG, okay? On the U.S. side, MARAD, thank you to all of my friends from the U.S. Maritime Administration for providing $653 million to help fund 41 different projects, port projects throughout the United States. All of these projects have been put towards different projects in terms of infrastructure, pier and terminal development, trying to improve the truck capacity so that the trucks are actually moving through the ports a little bit more efficiently and quickly, providing more capacity to shore power. So when the vessels pull into port and they tie up to the berth, that they can actually plug in now to a shore power, right? And having money available too, so that some of the ports are actually moving a lot of their material handling equipment, forklifts, gantry cranes, to an EV charging type system. So rather than having all of my material handling equipment be diesel powered, I'm trying to get them over to electric. But in order to do that, I need an investment. And that's where MARAD has been very helpful to provide some of those investments. Additionally, CMA CGM also provided a significant investment in the Port Liberty terminal up in Newark, New Jersey, so of $600 million. And again, they're looking to do this so they can improve their own infrastructure, not just for their vessels, but they're having the infrastructure available that potentially could be used for other sources. And again, what can we do if I'm the ship company like CMA CGM? What can I do to help improve the emissions in my local community? So, and that's the other big part in terms of what we can all do is this interconnection piece. So it's not just in terms of the connections of supply chain and logistics. Well, if I'm a ship company, I'm coming in and out of the port and my own terminal. Well, my terminal really is in the city of New York, New Jersey. So I got to be really paying a lot of attention to the rest of my community. And I want to make sure that they're safe because those community members, they're also my employees. So the more I could do to help my employees, the better off I'm going to look, not just as a company, but I'm doing the right thing. Okay, even in terms of some of the additional port investments, right? So Port Authority's commitments to sustainability has been very wide and broad. So it has come about from reducing the carbon emissions to improving air quality, what we can do to increase efficiency in container handling. So again, the quicker I can move a container through my terminal, I'm actually reducing the amount of emissions. By reducing my emissions, I have less carbon emitted out in the air. Providing the onshore power like we just talked about, improve some of that interchange cooperations between the different modes, like between the port and the railroad over to trucking, or even trucking into the warehousing and then moving it all back through that system. So currently we have about 57% of our ports have onshore power supply that's available at one or more berths. 42% have an LNG bunkering at that facility. So this is on a global scale, not necessarily here in the US. So this was based on a particular report conducted in Europe. So the Europeans are certainly much further ahead of that port investment in terms of what they can do to improve the environment rather than the US. But we're catching up. We're getting there. 63% of the respondents of their ports also offer a reduced port fee for the greener vessels based on particular waste management systems, greenhouse gas emissions, noise reduction, and other environmental certifications. So for me, looking at ports to provide some opportunities, this might be a good opportunity for one port to say, what can I do to help attract a new shipping line to come to my port versus another? Or what can I do to actually improve carbon emissions in my own environment and my community? Because again, port authorities actually operate as a part of the community. What can I do to help my community? Well, can I actually incentivize the different shipping lines by giving them a lower port fee by operating a cleaner vessel? Okay. And the last thing I want to provide you, at least in terms of this slide. So here's a quote from Keith Svensson, who's CEO of APM Terminals, so a division of Maersk. So let me be clear, we need to accelerate all of our work in decarbonization. Decarbonizing the maritime industry is what he's really focused on. And we need to do so, and we need to do it now. And what he was talking about is that APM Terminals, in cooperation with DP World, so another terminal operator, have come together and says, we are going to have a significant amount of focus and effort and investment on changing our material handling equipment in our ports from diesel over to some type of a green alternative fuel. More than likely, a lot of it's probably going to be electric currently, but they're also investing a lot of dollars in terms of what else can be used. What are going to be the new alternative fuels to help move some of our material handling equipment in our ports? So let me start to wrap this up a little bit for everybody. So in terms of my suggestions to ports, what can we do? What should we be looking for? What should we be driving for to help improve the nature of improving emissions, improving our air quality? So I mentioned this before, certainly improving the interchange connections. Getting containers off of a vessel is one part in the entire supply chain leg. If I can get the containers off the vessel quicker, if I can move those containers through my terminal more efficiently, I'm in the process of actually reducing the emissions. And if I can continue to do so at a higher rate, I'm actually improving the emissions that much better. Oh, and by the way, now I got to think it's not just getting the containers out of my terminal or the product out of my terminal. How quickly can I do that in my terminal, but also with that connection with the railroad, like I said? Can I invite my railroad partners to potentially put a line closer to my facility so I can move the containers out faster, right? And if I can do that, what type of equipment can they provide that's also going to be a cleaner type of fuel, right? So rather than always using a diesel powered locomotive, do they have green alternative type locomotives that we could potentially use to move the goods out? Okay, so the more efficient we can become in the terminals, the better off we're all going to be. A better way to look at this too is when we look at a terminal is nothing more than one of the primary bottlenecks in the entire supply chain. And if you really need a better example, let's rewind the clock to early spring of 2021, when the ports of LA Long Beach had roughly over 100 ports or 100 ships that were tied up offshore because the port itself was just so congested. Well, with that congestion, again, there's a lot of emissions just being absorbed right in that area, not just from the ships, but think about all of the trucks, all of the draymen, all of the trains that are still trying to operate in all of that congestion. And that congestion also equates going back out on the roads, because now you have the draymen waiting in line with their trucks idling, which is also increasing more emissions, right? What can we do to continue that reduction in our port emissions? So we got to continue to drive harder on that, like I just mentioned. I certainly, both as an academic and practitioner, I think we really need to invest much more in terms of automating our terminals. And I know that's going to be very controversial and it's going to be very challenging, but if we are very serious as a nation about improving air quality and reducing emissions, we have the capacity and the ability and technology to do it. Let's really start implementing it much more. The rest of the world is certainly much further ahead of us than we are, but I think it's time that we actually start to catch up to the rest of the world and we actually become greater leaders in this. So I would also recommend at least a port. Great opportunity to start preserving some cash for some of those infrastructure investments that are going to be coming up. We don't know what those investments are going to be. Interest rates are also relatively high still today. The Federal Reserve, Jay mentioned yesterday that there might be the opportunity where interest rates may come down next year. We don't know. But again, great opportunity that, hey, I know I'm going to make an investment at some point. I'm going to need to if I want to remain competitive. So I need to start saving for that investment when it comes, right? So let's determine also if the technology is safe to change. So we got a lot of different opportunities in regards to different fuels, some of which may not be the most safe, not only for the communities and the ports, but also for the mariners at sea. Determine if the regulatory bodies are also on board with all of these changes. So we could all point to the IMO, and I've already shown that their direction is okay at best. If the EU is going to go in one direction, the United States goes in another direction, Japan goes in a third direction, that pretty much tells me that those different regulatory bodies really are not necessarily all on board and providing better direction to the maritime industry. The other part in all of this is, where do the classification societies sit? Where's ABS? Where's D&K? Where's NK or Class NK? So they're all involved and they're trying to do what they can. But again, a lot of this takes time, you know? So even in terms of the other regulatory bodies, U.S. Coast Guard, MARAD, thank you not only for attending this, but also for being out there and being forefront leaders in terms of trying to teach the rest of the maritime industry and communities about what we really should be driving for, okay? Understanding too that the nature of all of this change is going to take time, all right? And by the way, as the market person, time equals money. So if any of the states, the U.S. states, want to have a brand new, if they want to enact new legislation that's going to upend the industry, all right, they're welcome to do so because that's their law-given opportunity. But the quicker that they want that change, it's really going to cost me as a company more. My operating costs are going to increase. My operating costs are going to increase. You know, unfortunately, I have to pass those costs down to my customers. And eventually, my customers are going to have to pass it down to their customers. So those costs are actually going to be absorbed by you and I as consumers at some point. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. But again, the faster we do it, the costs increase exponentially. So let's plan, let's work together to really determine what's the best appropriate approach given a certain amount of time. Another opportunity or suggestion, there's a lot of different bodies out there that have a strong voice for ports and the maritime industry. Certainly the IAMPE could be one of those driving forces. The IRPT, the Inland River Ports and Terminals Association, and definitely the AAPA, the American Association of Port Authorities. Having a more combined voice between these three organizations to notify MARAD, Coast Guard, some of these different states, maybe up to and including the IMO, like, hey, here's really what we're hearing from our industry members, okay? Let's get that combined concerted effort going together rather than all of us going in different directions. We also need to make sure, and I'm going to really focus this on not just the shipping lines, certainly the BCOs and definitely the ports, prepare our customers and the consumers for the additional cost increase. Me as a consumer, I never like to pay more money than I have to. I hate seeing any of the price of my goods increase. It's challenging for me because as an academic, I also have to be schizophrenic, especially teaching business and logistics. I understand why we're doing the cost increases. So I advocate for it on the one hand as a business because I have to cover my operating costs. Yet as a consumer, then I start to have this argument with myself in the grocery store. Okay. But at what point, at some point, sooner the better, we really need to start educating our communities and the consumers that these costs are coming and the cost to operate is necessary because we're trying to do this to improve climate change. We're trying to improve and decrease our carbon emissions. And certainly understand that the BCOs can import and export from various foreign ports. And that's also a big change in how we think, especially as Americans. Me as a shipper at one time, we typically, our containers came in and out of the United States ports, and that was it. Yet at the same time, based on how our logistics network is actually developed, fortunately through infrastructure, I know I can also import containers through Prince Rupert in Canada, have it railed all the way down into Chicago, and once it's in Chicago, I can still hit both ends of the coast. I can hit the entire United States. I also have great infrastructure, highway infrastructure there. If some of the ports, if Prince Rupert was closed down for a natural disaster or for a labor disagreement, I potentially could go to Port Halifax. Obviously, it's still in Canada, which still may have a challenge. All right, that makes sense. Could go into the United States. Okay, I got both of those codes on both ports. Sure, but we also have challenge of organized labor. We just had the West Coast unions resolve their contract earlier this year. Next year, the ILA on the East Coast ports go through their negotiations. So if there's going to be a disruption in my supply chain, as a BCO, I really need to start thinking today as to what my alternative ports are going to be. All right, well, I just talked about two Canadian ones. Obviously, I have the West Coast ports, but we also have ports down in Mexico on both sides of the oceans, on the Pacific and Atlantic side. I can have vessels go into those ports, have my containers offloaded, placed on a CPKC train, railed again, right back up into Kansas City, over to Memphis, into Chicago, and I can still branch everything across the United States. As a BCO, I still can hit all of my markets without using U.S. ports if necessary. Not that I'm saying I'm advocating for that, but as a BCO, and certainly COVID taught us this, I have to look for all of the different alternative options available to keep my supply chain more resilient. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time today. Certainly want to thank all of our friends, Captain Monroe and David from the IAMPE for their assistance in allowing me to spend some time with you talking about the port's role in decarbonizing the maritime industry. So, David, I think we have some time available for some Q&A.
Yep, got a couple of questions in here, as well as one comment from Emily Federer, who wanted to point out that the Port of New Orleans has LNG and methanol bunkering available for ships.
There we go. See, I told you, I knew I was going to forget someone, so my apologies.
So thank you, Emily, for pointing that out. Okay, so our first question, there's a little bit of setup here. In light of recent data showing that alternative fuels are significantly less efficient than fossil fuels, with some estimates suggesting that they are up to 30% less energy efficient. I'm compelled to question the rationale behind the IMO's push for net zero emissions by 2050. So here's the question. Why would an organization prioritize environmentally driven goals over the clear economic advantages of fossil fuels, especially when stakeholder value and profitability are paramount in today's business climate? Isn't this shift towards less efficient energy sources a direct contradiction to the fundamental principle of maximizing shareholder value?
Great question. The easy answer would be yes. Obviously, as an academic, I know that that answer would not be acceptable for any one of my essays. So students take note of that. Yes, I agree that what we're trying to do, I want to switch to a new fuel source that may not be as efficient as current fuel source. Okay. Yet at the same time, that efficiency, that reduction in efficiency is also going to come with a higher cost of fuel. So let me see if I got this right. I got to spend a lot more money to use this green alternative fuel for my ship, and I'm going to have less efficiency out of it. Yep, that's a challenge. Now, how does that shipping line go back and tell their shareholders, hey, by the way, our revenue pretty much stayed the same. Our operating costs have just increased by, I believe, 30% or whatever the rate was. It certainly had a higher increase. My asset utilization is also going to decrease because I'm going to be limited in terms of the lanes where my vessels are going to sail. So yeah, stock market, you can't beat me up on this because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is still improve society. And while that may be very difficult for one company to say, because pretty much then everybody's going to really vote with their feet. On the other hand, if the industry speaks as a collective voice, which is what I was trying to describe before, not just the ports, but the steamship lines saying, this is what the consumers should expect. This is what the BCOs should be expecting. I am going to be operating much less efficiently, and I'm going to be operating less efficiently with a higher cost. So be prepared that at the end of the day, my bottom line is going to be an impact, which is going to impact my stock price. Okay. But we're doing it for the right reasons. And by the way, everybody really needs to get on board with this kind of an approach. And I don't mean to make that, as a means to grandstand, but right at the end of the day, that's really what it's boiling down to.
Thank you, Don. All right, our next question. The United States has many states that have a moratorium on nuclear. The new small modular reactors will start testing in 2027, I'm assuming, and should be ready for deployment by 2030 and certainly by 2035. What are the ports doing to work within their states to be sure that they are ready for this new, very safe nuclear electric propulsion?
Okay, so my students know this because I've mentioned this in class a few times, but for everybody else in the audience or online, I am an advocate of nuclear. So where I come from, nuclear energy is a way of life. It's inexpensive, it's clean, little to no emissions. Yet nuclear also has this bad rap that all of us still remember. And because of that, it's going to be very difficult for these communities to really change the public's mindset that, oh, by the way, we're going to have this, David, I forgot the term that you used, mid-size, I don't want to say nuclear reactor. That wasn't the right word.
Small modular reactors.
Yeah, there you go. So the small modular reactor near our port. So we have a much better opportunity to provide shore power. Okay. Again, great opportunity for industry to really move towards. Going to be a bigger challenge to educate the rest of the community of us going in that direction. That's where I think we definitely need to have some of the support from Washington to really start driving and having some of these conversations today as we go forward. That will certainly help a lot of our ports and the states to say this is really a much better way to operate. I understand that we have this moratorium on it, and that's very unfortunate. But let's go back to that first question. We have an opportunity where you want me to increase my costs so I can operate cleaner, but I'm also going to operate more inefficiently. Yet we have this other technology over here that might be able to, if not eliminate, reduce some of those obstacles. And in order for me to really get those moving forward, I need to have some more political support to do this. And by the way, so let's go back to that market system. So if one of the states says, well, let the market figure it out. Okay. Well, if that state is going to hold that moratorium, hopefully not all states do that. So if a state says no mid-sized nuclear reactors, sorry, maybe the state next to it at their ports are saying, you know what, we're willing to look at this new technology because we believe in it and we believe that it's safe and we're actually going to improve the rest of our community. The one thing I forgot to mention, David, and I apologize for everybody else, and we see this right now with EV cars, and I'm a proponent of that, but I'm also a stronger proponent of making sure that we have the infrastructure available to support it. And that definitely will be the case in some of these communities that are large metropolitan communities, that if we are going to require the ships to go to shore power, which they should, and if we're going to have a lot more material handling equipment in our terminals operating on electric, will the electric grid system support that amount of use? And I'm not necessarily convinced, and I'm not an engineer by trade, not an engineer at all. I'm not necessarily convinced that the grid can actually support it today. So when we start looking at something like nuclear, that might be a much better opportunity, especially if it's small to mid-size, as the question proposed, just in those particular areas. Because again, if we have an ice storm or a fire or a windstorm, that's going to shut down our electric system, right? We have brownouts all the time, not just here in Tennessee, California, Illinois. I would say Maine, but that wasn't because of brownouts, because of population. So not sure if that helps, David.
Thank you. All right, that's all the questions we had. So thank you, everybody, for attending. My name's David Arnold. I'm the Executive Director of the International Association of Maritime Port Executives. I'd like to thank Dr. Meyer for his presentation today. Let's go ahead and give Dr. Meyer a round of virtual applause. If you can go ahead and find that reaction tab, hit the clapping like that.
Keep it clean.
So if you would like to learn more about the IAMPE, go ahead and take a peek at our website, www.iampe.org. We offer full week maritime port executive programs that cover every aspect of maritime port management. We have some coming up in Savannah, Georgia, this December 4th through the 8th, in the British Virgin Islands next February, in New Orleans in March, and in Norfolk, Virginia next April. And we're constantly adding new programs to our schedule on our website. We do also offer bespoke programs, and we're always happy to answer your questions. So if you have any questions or feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Drop us a note, send us a message to our website. Also, we publish a weekly industry newsletter, Port Notes. You can subscribe to that from our website, or you can send us an email and let us know that you want us to put you on there. We're also planning on offering more of these webinars, so stay tuned. So with that, let's give Dr. Meyer one more quick round of applause. Thank you, Dr. Meyer, and thank you everyone for attending this afternoon.